The courtroom went completely silent when my sister stood up and said, "Those babies were supposed to be mine." I remember looking at her and wondering how we had reached that moment. Not because I didn't understand that she was hurting. I did. What I couldn't understand was how her pain had somehow become a reason for everyone to question my right to protect my own children. The judge looked toward her attorney. Her husband stared at the floor. My mother sat behind them with both hands folded tightly in her lap. And I said nothing. That was something my family had always been good at expecting from me. Silence. Patience. Understanding. I was supposed to be the strong one. The reasonable one. The daughter who could absorb disappointment and still smile at family dinners. But by the time we reached that courtroom, I had learned something important. Sometimes staying quiet doesn't mean you have nothing to say. Sometimes it means you are waiting for the truth to speak for you. Months earlier, before the police reports and court papers, before the investigators and the protective order, my life had been much simpler. I had spent years trying to become a mother. There had been appointments, tests, hopeful conversations, and quiet disappointments that I learned not to discuss at family gatherings. Then one morning, everything changed. I was pregnant. Not only pregnant. I was carrying twins. I remember sitting in my car after the appointment, holding the ultrasound pictures in my lap and staring at them for several minutes before I could even breathe normally. 2 tiny lives. 2 heartbeats. 2 babies I had already started loving. I told my husband first. Then, after several days of keeping the news between us, I decided to tell my mother. I trusted her. That mattered. My sister had struggled with infertility for years, and everyone in our family knew how painful the subject was for her. I didn't want my pregnancy announced at the wrong time or in the wrong way. So I asked my mother to keep it private until my sister's baby shower. I thought that was reasonable. I thought she understood. I was wrong. The secret came out in the middle of the shower. One moment everyone was laughing and talking around a table covered with gifts and flowers. The next, my mother had accidentally, or perhaps not accidentally, let the word slip. She's having twins. The room changed. At first, nobody knew what to say. Then my sister looked directly at me. Her face had gone completely pale. I stood there with one hand resting against my stomach. She didn't congratulate me. She didn't even ask if I was okay. She grabbed the cake knife. Someone gasped. My mother rushed toward her, but my sister pulled the knife close to herself and began crying. "You stole my life," she said. I remember how strange those words sounded. I hadn't stolen anything. I hadn't taken anything from her. But she wasn't finished. "You stole my babies?" The room fell silent. I looked at my mother, waiting for her to correct her. Instead, she whispered, "She's upset." That was all. Not, "This isn't true." Not, "Put the knife down." Just, "She's upset." I took one slow step backward. My husband moved closer to me. My sister kept talking, her voice growing louder as everyone watched. She said I had always been lucky. She said I had everything she deserved. She said the twins should never have been mine. I didn't argue. I didn't tell her she was wrong. I simply let my husband guide me away from the table. At the time, I thought the incident was the worst thing that would happen. I was mistaken. Over the next few weeks, small things began changing around me. A piece of mail disappeared. Then another. A delivery arrived that I had never ordered. The hospital called about a question I had supposedly asked, even though I hadn't contacted them. Someone began appearing across the street from our house. Nothing was clear enough to prove anything. Each event could have been explained away. That was what made it so frightening. I kept telling myself not to become paranoid. I kept telling myself my family was simply struggling with an impossible situation. But there was one detail I could not explain. Someone knew things about my pregnancy that I had told only my mother. And I had no idea yet how far that secret had already traveled. What I didn't know then was that my mother had opened a door into my private life. And someone else was already waiting on the other side. The first strange thing I noticed was not the missing mail. It was my mother's voice. She stopped asking whether I was sleeping well, whether the babies were growing normally, or whether I needed anything. Instead, every conversation somehow returned to my sister. Was she eating? Was she sleeping? Had I called her? Was I being careful around her feelings? It was as if my pregnancy had become something my family needed to manage for her. I had seen this pattern before. For most of our lives, my sister had been the fragile one. If she was upset, everyone lowered their voices. If she was angry, everyone searched for the reason. If she made a mistake, someone usually found an explanation for it. And if I was hurt, I was told I could handle it. "You're the strong one," my mother used to say. I had heard those words so many times that they eventually stopped sounding like praise. They sounded like an assignment. Be strong. Don't complain. Don't make things harder. Keep the family together. So when my sister reacted badly to my pregnancy, part of me tried to understand her. She had wanted a baby for years. I knew that pain. Or at least I thought I did. What I didn't understand was why everyone seemed more concerned about protecting her from my happiness than protecting me from her behavior. After the baby shower incident, my mother called me several times. She never apologized. She never asked whether I had been frightened when my sister grabbed the knife. Instead, she kept saying the same thing. She isn't herself right now. I remember sitting at my kitchen table with one hand resting over my stomach. "She still grabbed a knife," I said. There was a long pause. Then my mother sighed. "You know how much she's been through." I looked down at the ultrasound photograph beside my coffee. "Yes," I said quietly. "I know." That was the end of the conversation. At least for that day. A few mornings later, I noticed that one of our envelopes was missing. It wasn't an important letter. That was almost what bothered me most. It was ordinary. Something that should have arrived, been opened, and forgotten. I asked my husband if he had moved it. He hadn't. We checked the porch, the kitchen counter, the recycling bin. Nothing. I tried not to think about it. Then a package arrived that I had never ordered. It contained baby items. Small blankets. A bottle warmer. A set of newborn onesies. There was no gift message. No name I recognized. My husband looked at me. "Did your mother send this?" I shook my head. I contacted the company, but they couldn't tell me much. Someone had placed the order using information connected to my name. I began keeping the strange things in a drawer. The missing mail. The delivery information. Screenshots. Dates. I didn't know why I was doing it. I just had a feeling I would need them later. Then the hospital called. A woman asked whether I had recently requested information about changing one of my prenatal appointments. I hadn't. She paused. "I thought perhaps your mother was helping you." My stomach tightened. My mother doesn't schedule my appointments. The woman apologized and said she would make a note. I didn't mention my sister. Not yet. That night, my husband checked the windows before we went to bed. He had started doing that without being asked. Then he noticed someone standing across the street. A person near a parked car. Too far away to identify. They didn't approach our house. They simply stood there. The next evening, the same thing happened. Then again. Maybe it was nothing. That was what I kept telling myself. But fear rarely arrives as one large event. Sometimes it comes as 10 tiny things that refuse to make sense when you look at them separately. I started changing small routines. I stopped leaving mail outside. I checked the locks twice. I asked the doctor's office to confirm every appointment directly with me. And I began writing everything down. Still, I didn't confront my family. My husband wanted me to. I told him I wasn't ready. "What if we're wrong?" I asked. He looked at the notes spread across our table. "What if you're not?" I didn't answer. Because deep down, I already knew which possibility frightened me more. Then another package arrived. This one contained something I had never told my sister about. A specific item I had mentioned only during a private conversation with my mother. I stood in the doorway holding the box. My hands were shaking. Not because of the package itself. Because suddenly, all those small incidents looked different. The missing mail. The hospital call. The deliveries. The person across the street. Someone was getting information from somewhere. And I knew exactly where I had first trusted that information. My mother. I still wanted to believe there was an innocent explanation. I wanted to believe my family could not possibly be doing this to me. But the truth was already moving toward me. And I had no idea how close it was. The hospital message arrived at 8:17 on a Tuesday morning. It was only one sentence, but I read it 3 times. We received your request. Please confirm that the changes were authorized. I had never requested any changes. For several seconds, I just sat there staring at my phone. Then I remembered the old patient portal. Years earlier, when I was dealing with a routine medical issue, I had given my mother limited access to help me with paperwork. I had forgotten about it. Apparently, the system had not. I called the hospital immediately. The woman on the phone checked my records and became noticeably more careful with her words. There is an active authorization on your account, she explained. Who has access? She paused. Your mother. I closed my eyes. I didn't accuse her. Not yet. I simply asked for the authorization to be removed. Then I asked for something else. Can you tell me whether the account was recently accessed? Another pause. Yes. That single word changed everything. Someone had been looking at my medical information. My pregnancy. My appointments. Possibly even information about my babies. I called my mother that afternoon. I didn't tell her what the hospital had said. I wanted to hear what she would volunteer. Mom, I said, keeping my voice calm, have you been checking on my pregnancy? She became defensive almost immediately. Of course I have. I'm your mother. That isn't what I asked. Silence. Then she sighed. I was worried about you. I looked through the notes I had started keeping. The dates. The missing mail. The hospital call. The packages. The person across the street. Have you been sharing information with my sister? My mother's voice softened. She needs support. That answer told me more than a confession could have. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply said, please don't access my medical information again. Then I ended the call. For the first time, I understood that this wasn't about one emotional outburst at a baby shower. It was becoming a pattern. And patterns could be documented. That evening, I showed everything to my lawyer. She read through the notes without interrupting. When she reached the hospital records, she stopped. You need to stop confronting them, she said. I looked at her. Why? Because right now, they know you're suspicious. She closed the folder. If they know what you know, they'll become more careful. I understood. You want me to wait. I want you to document. She leaned back in her chair. Let them keep talking. Let them keep making mistakes. Don't give them a warning. That was difficult. I wanted answers. I wanted my mother to explain herself. I wanted my sister to admit that something was wrong. Instead, I was being asked to remain silent while my own family crossed boundaries around me. But my lawyer was right. So I waited. And I started keeping records properly. Every suspicious delivery. Every unknown call. Every time someone appeared near our house. Every contact with the hospital. Everything went into one folder. My husband helped me organize it. We didn't know where it would lead. But we knew we couldn't rely on memory alone. A few days later, my lawyer suggested something else. We need a controlled piece of information. I knew exactly what she meant. Something harmless. Something believable. Something that only one person would receive. We created a false detail about one of my upcoming appointments. I told my mother about it during an ordinary phone call. I made my voice casual. I didn't emphasize it. I didn't even sound worried. Then I waited. The next morning, my sister sent me a message. It was short. You shouldn't be changing doctors without telling the family. I stared at the screen. My heart began beating faster. I had never told my sister anything about changing doctors. She shouldn't have known. I forwarded the message to my lawyer. Her response came almost immediately. Save it. I did. Then another message arrived from my sister. You think you can hide everything from me? I didn't reply. I put the phone face down. For years, I had believed that keeping quiet was how I kept peace in my family. Now I was learning that silence could mean something else. It could give the truth room to reveal itself. The false information had traveled exactly where we expected it to go. And that meant someone was still feeding my sister private details. Someone close enough to know what I was saying. Someone who still had access. Someone who believed I hadn't noticed. I looked at the growing folder on our kitchen table. For the first time, I wasn't wondering whether something was happening. I was wondering how much of it had already happened. And my lawyer had just begun tracing the answer. The truth about my sister's pregnancy came from the last person I expected to hear from. Her husband called my lawyer first. He didn't ask to speak to me directly. He said he was afraid. Not of me. Of what would happen if my sister found out he had finally told the truth. When my lawyer called me, she asked me to sit down before she explained. I remember looking at the chair beside me and thinking that I didn't want to sit. Somehow, I already knew the conversation was going to change everything. She lost the pregnancy, my lawyer said quietly. I didn't understand at first. Who? Your sister. The room seemed to become very still. Her husband had told my lawyer that the pregnancy had ended months earlier. There had been no baby shower. No announcement. No hospital record that matched the story my family had continued telling. My sister had lost the pregnancy. And instead of allowing her to grieve, my mother had helped her pretend it had never happened. At first, I felt something I hadn't expected. Pity. I knew what it meant to want a child desperately. I knew what it meant to see other women become mothers while you were still waiting for your own chance. I could understand grief. What I couldn't understand was what happened next. According to her husband, my sister had refused to accept the loss. She continued telling people she was pregnant. She continued acting as though the baby was still coming. And my mother had gone along with it. My mother believed she was protecting her daughter. She thought keeping the truth hidden would keep my sister from falling apart. But secrets don't disappear because people mean well. They grow. They change shape. And eventually, they start hurting people who had nothing to do with the original pain. My lawyer continued explaining what her husband had told her. Over time, my sister had become convinced that my pregnancy was somehow connected to hers. At first, she had simply been jealous. Then she began asking questions about my appointments. Then she started talking about my twins as though she had some kind of connection to them. And eventually, according to her husband, she began saying something that frightened him. She believed my babies were supposed to replace the children she had lost. I sat there listening. The pieces were beginning to fit. The cake knife. The accusations. The packages. The hospital calls. The missing mail. The photographs. The person outside our house. But knowing why something was happening didn't make it less frightening. If anything, it made the danger clearer. My sister wasn't simply angry with me. She had built an entire story in her mind. And my mother had been helping her believe it. I asked my lawyer what we should do. She didn't hesitate. We keep documenting. I looked at her. She thinks my babies belong to her. I know. And you still want me to stay quiet? Yes. She placed the file on the table between us. Because if you confront her now, she can say you misunderstood. She can say she was emotional. She can say you're exaggerating. She tapped the folder. But these records don't get emotional. That sentence stayed with me. I went home that evening and told my husband everything. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he looked toward the nursery we had started preparing. The room was still simple. 2 cribs. 2 small blankets. A rocking chair. Nothing extravagant. Just a quiet space waiting for our daughters. We're not giving this up, he said. I shook my head. I know. And I meant it. Still, I didn't want revenge. I didn't want my sister humiliated. I didn't want my mother punished just because I was angry. I wanted distance. Safety. And the chance to bring my daughters into the world without someone else trying to claim them. So we followed the plan. My lawyer arranged for formal records to be preserved. The hospital removed my mother's access. We secured our home. And we continued recording every strange event. Then we created another controlled detail. This time, it involved something that mattered. A supposed change to one of my upcoming appointments. Only my mother received the information. I didn't tell my sister. I didn't tell any other relative. I didn't post anything online. I simply waited. It took less than 24 hours. My sister contacted me. She wasn't asking whether the information was true. She was angry that I had supposedly made a decision without telling her. I read the message twice. Then I handed my phone to my husband. He looked at it and slowly shook his head. She got it from your mother. We didn't need to guess anymore. We had a pattern. But there was still something we didn't know. Why had my mother gone so far? Why had she allowed my sister to believe that my children were somehow part of her lost pregnancy? And how far was my sister willing to go to make that belief real? I thought the answers would come from another message. They didn't. They came from a place much darker. Because while we were building a case against the people watching us, someone else was quietly building something for my babies. And I wouldn't discover what it was until detectives opened a door that should never have existed. The anonymous report arrived before my daughters were even born. It said I was unstable. It said I was overwhelmed. And somehow, it suggested that my unborn children might not be safe with me. I read the report twice without saying a word. Then I handed my phone to my husband. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The strange thing was that some of the details were true. Not the accusations. The private details. Information about my pregnancy that should never have appeared in a complaint from a stranger. My appointment history. Small details about my pregnancy. Even references to things that had happened inside our home. Someone wasn't guessing. Someone was using information that had been taken from me. I called my lawyer. She didn't sound surprised. She sounded tired. Send me everything, she said. I forwarded the report. Then the hospital records. Then the messages. Then the photographs. Everything went into the same file. For weeks, I had been collecting pieces without knowing exactly what picture they would create. Now the picture was becoming clearer. The people around my sister were not simply watching me. They were trying to create a story about me. A story where I was unstable. A story where I was incapable of caring for my own children. A story where someone else might eventually be allowed to decide what happened to my babies. That frightened me more than the strange people outside our house ever had. Because an accusation could travel farther than a threat. It could enter a system. It could become a record. It could follow you even after the person who made it disappeared. My lawyer understood that. We don't fight this emotionally, she told me. She placed the growing file on the table between us. We answer with evidence. That became our rule. Evidence first. Emotion second. I wanted to call my mother. I wanted to ask her how she could help build something like this against her own daughter. But I didn't. I knew what would happen. She would cry. She would talk about my sister's grief. She would say she had never meant for things to go this far. And somehow, by the end of the conversation, I would be the one apologizing for making everyone uncomfortable. I had lived that pattern for years. I wasn't going to live it again. So I stayed quiet. And the silence seemed to make the other side more confident. A few days later, another delivery appeared at our door. Then another. Neither was addressed in a way that made sense. My husband began checking the cameras every night. One evening, he called me into the living room. There. He pointed toward the screen. A car had stopped across the street. It stayed there for several minutes. Then it left. We saved the footage. The next day, we saved another recording. Then another. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. My lawyer asked investigators to compare the dates. The visits seemed to happen around medical appointments, deliveries, and family conversations. Someone was tracking my life. Quietly. Patiently. And that meant they believed they had time. I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me panic. I still went to my appointments. I still bought tiny clothes. I still sat in the nursery at night and imagined two little girls sleeping in the cribs. There were moments when I almost felt normal. Then my phone would ring. Or a strange envelope would appear. Or another message would arrive. And the fear would return. But something else had changed too. I wasn't alone anymore. My husband knew everything. My lawyer had the records. Investigators were watching the pattern. And every new mistake made by the people behind it gave us something else to preserve. Then my lawyer called with an update. The false information we had planted earlier had been repeated again. This time, it appeared in a new message connected to my sister. The detail had been shared exactly as we had given it to my mother. There was no innocent explanation left. The leak was real. and my mother was still connected to it. My lawyer told me we had enough evidence to move forward with stronger legal protection. I remember asking her one question. Will it stop them? She was quiet for a moment. It should. Should. Not would. That word stayed with me. Because by then, I had learned that people who believed they were entitled to your life did not always stop simply because you asked them to. Still, we moved forward. The protective order process began. I thought that would finally force everyone to step back. Instead, the pressure increased. The calls became more frequent. The reports became more serious. And just when I thought the situation couldn't become more personal, investigators discovered something connected to the harassment that made my stomach drop. A payment. A rental payment. A storage unit. At first, I didn't understand why that mattered. Then my lawyer told me what investigators had found. The unit was not rented under my sister's name. It wasn't rented under her husband's name. It was connected to someone I had trusted my entire life. My mother. I sat completely still. For years, I had been told I was the strong one. The one who could handle anything. The one who should keep the family together. But now I understood something. Keeping a family together was not worth losing myself. And whatever was inside that storage unit was about to prove exactly how far my family had gone. Because investigators weren't looking for a box of stolen mail. They were preparing to open a door. And behind that door was something no one had warned me about. Something built specifically for my children. I thought the storage unit would contain evidence. I was not prepared for it to contain a future. The detectives had been following the payment records for several days. The unit was rented under a name connected to my mother, and the payments had been made regularly. There was enough evidence for them to obtain authorization to enter. I stayed home. My lawyer had advised me not to go with them. She said I didn't need to see everything with my own eyes for it to become part of the case. At the time, I was grateful. Later, I understood why. Because some things are harder to forget when you have actually stood inside them. The detective called me after they entered. His voice was calm. Almost too calm. We found a nursery. I didn't answer. A nursery? I finally asked. Yes. He paused. It appears to have been prepared for your twins. I looked toward the room in our house where we had placed 2 small cribs. For a moment, I couldn't understand what he meant. Then he continued. There are names painted on the walls. My stomach tightened. What names? He told me. My daughter's names. The exact names my husband and I had chosen privately. Names we had never announced publicly. Names my mother knew. I closed my eyes. The detective continued describing what they had found. There was a crib. Then another. A rocking chair. A dresser filled with newborn clothes. Blankets. Diapers. A small lamp shaped like a sheep. The room had been decorated carefully. Someone had painted clouds across the walls. It was supposed to look peaceful. That was what made it so disturbing. It wasn't a random room filled with stolen things. Someone had spent time creating it. Someone had imagined my daughters living there. The detective told me that the walls had their names painted beneath the clouds. I asked him to stop. Not because I didn't want to know. Because suddenly I knew enough. But there was more. They found my missing mail. Letters I had assumed had been lost. Medical records. Copies of appointment information. Notes about my schedule. Photographs of our house. Photographs taken from outside. Photographs of the front door. The nursery. Our driveway. Even the windows. Someone had been watching us closely. Then the detective mentioned another item. A draft complaint to Child Protection Authorities. I felt cold. The complaint had been written as though someone were preparing to take my children away. It described me as unstable. It questioned my ability to care for newborns. It contained details that had been pulled directly from my private medical information. Everything suddenly connected. The hospital access. The missing mail. The false report. The surveillance. The strange deliveries. The messages. None of it had been random. Someone had been building a case. Not just against me. For something else. My lawyer asked the detective whether they had found anything showing who had organized the nursery. There was a pause. Yes. I already knew the answer before he said it. The rental agreement was in my mother's name. The payment records were connected to her accounts. My mother had paid for the room. I sat down. For years, I had defended her. Even when she favored my sister, I had found reasons for it. She was trying to keep peace. She was protecting someone who was hurting. She didn't know how serious things had become. But this was different. A nursery doesn't appear by accident. Someone has to choose the furniture. Someone has to buy the clothes. Someone has to paint the walls. Someone has to write the names. Someone has to pay the rent. And my mother had done enough of those things to make the truth impossible to ignore. I called my husband. When I told him what the detectives had found, he was silent. Then he asked, "Did they find the babies' names?" "Yes." He didn't say anything for several seconds. Finally, he whispered, "They were planning for them." That was the part that frightened me most. Not the clothes. Not the photographs. Not even the stolen records. The planning. My sister had not simply imagined my children in some emotional moment. There had been preparation. A physical place. A room. A future. And somewhere in that plan, my children had been separated from me. The detective later told us they had also found photographs of my sister inside the unit. There were pictures of her standing near the nursery. Pictures of her holding baby clothes. Pictures of the room before it was finished. I didn't need anyone to explain what that meant. The evidence was explaining it for us. My lawyer began organizing everything into the case file. She didn't use dramatic words. She didn't need to. She simply listed what had been found. Medical records. Stolen mail. Surveillance photographs. The false complaint. The nursery. The payment records. My mother's name. One piece after another. For the first time since the nightmare began, I felt something close to relief. Not happiness. Not victory. Relief. Because I had spent weeks wondering whether people would believe me. Now I didn't need to convince anyone. The evidence existed outside of my voice. And that mattered. Still, one question remained. Why had they built that room? What did they believe was going to happen after my daughters were born? The answer was buried somewhere in the documents detectives had taken from the unit. And when my lawyer read the final note, she stopped turning pages. She looked at me quietly. Then she said, "You need to see this." I looked at the paper in her hand. It wasn't a nursery plan. It wasn't another complaint. It was something that suggested the room had never been meant to be temporary. Someone had been preparing for my daughters to live there. Without me, my daughters were born safely. That should have been the moment when everything finally became quiet. Instead, for the first few hours after their birth, I kept looking toward the hospital door. Not because I expected someone to walk in. Because I had spent so long preparing for danger that peace felt unfamiliar. My first daughter was tiny. Her fingers curled around mine when I touched her hand. Her sister slept beside her, wrapped in a white blanket with a small pink cap covering her head. I looked at them and felt something I had almost forgotten how to feel. Safe. For a few minutes, there were no lawyers. No reports. No missing mail. No strange cars outside our house. Just two newborn girls breathing softly beside me. My husband sat in the chair near the bed. He looked exhausted. But he was smiling. "We made it," he whispered. I nodded. We did. I wanted to believe that was the end. I wanted to believe that once my daughters were born, everyone would finally understand that they were real people, not pieces in someone else's story. But the next morning, my lawyer called. There had been another report. Anonymous. This time, it was filed after the twins were born. The timing alone made my stomach tighten. I asked what it said. My lawyer explained that someone had again questioned whether I was capable of caring for my children. The accusations were similar to the earlier complaint. But this time, there were details about the babies. Their birth. Their hospital stay. My recovery. Information that should have been private. I looked down at my daughters while she spoke. They were sleeping. Completely unaware that someone was trying to turn their arrival into evidence against their mother. I remember feeling angry for the first time in a long time. Not loud anger. Not the kind that makes you shout. Something quieter. A decision. I wasn't going to let anyone else's grief become my daughter's childhood. I told my lawyer to move forward with everything. She said the evidence from the storage unit had changed the case. The medical records, the stolen mail, the photographs, the surveillance, the draft complaint, the nursery, the payment records. All of it formed one pattern. The anonymous report was no longer standing by itself. It was another piece, another attempt to create a story about me. But now we had the evidence to show where that story came from. My husband and I stayed in the hospital a little longer than expected. Not because the girls were in danger. They were healthy. I simply needed time. Time to hold them. Time to breathe. Time to let myself believe that I was allowed to enjoy being their mother. One afternoon, my husband stood beside the window while I held one of the girls against my chest. He looked at me and said, "You don't have to keep explaining yourself." I smiled faintly. "I know. And you don't have to fix your family." I looked down at our daughter. "I know that too." That was a difficult lesson for me. For years, I had believed love meant keeping everyone connected, even when they hurt each other, even when they hurt me. But there was a difference between keeping a family together and keeping a dangerous situation alive. I was beginning to understand it. The protective order process moved forward. The evidence from the storage unit gave investigators something concrete to work with. The false information we had planted earlier helped show how private details had been reaching my sister. The hospital access records showed how my mother had obtained information. The payment records connected her to the storage unit. And the nursery itself showed something words never could. Someone had been planning for my babies. Without me. My lawyer told me that the court hearing would be the next major step. Everything would be presented there. For months, my family had told themselves different versions of what happened. My sister had been overwhelmed. My mother had been protecting her. I had been too sensitive. The reports were misunderstandings. The strange incidents were coincidences. But those explanations were becoming harder to maintain. There would be documents now. Dates. Records. Photographs. Receipts. Witnesses. Facts. I thought about the first time my sister had looked at me across that baby shower table. She had been holding a cake knife. She had said I stole her babies. Back then, everyone treated it like an emotional breakdown. Now I understood that those words had been a warning. The problem was that nobody had listened. I had. And I had documented everything. Still, there was one thing I feared. What would happen when my sister finally saw all the evidence? Would she understand? Would she apologize? Would she finally accept that my daughters were mine? I didn't know. And I refused to predict it. The only thing I knew was that the hearing was coming. My family would be there. The investigators would be there. The evidence would be there. And for once, I would not have to convince anyone to believe me. The truth would be sitting in the room with us. I spent the final night before the hearing at home with my daughters. One slept against my shoulder. The other lay beside me in her crib. I watched them for a long time. Then I whispered the same thing to both of them. "You're safe." I didn't know if I was promising them something I could control. But I meant it. The next morning, we left for court. And behind us, in a quiet nursery, 2 newborn girls slept peacefully. Ahead of us waited the room where everyone who had doubted me would finally hear the story told by the evidence. And I knew one thing. The silence was almost over. The courtroom was full before the hearing even began. I noticed that first. People who had spent months telling me I was overreacting were suddenly sitting very still, waiting to hear what the evidence would say. My husband sat beside me. My lawyer had the case file open in front of her. Across the room, my sister sat beside her attorney. My mother was behind them. She looked smaller than I remembered. For months, she had been the person explaining everything away. Now she had nothing left to explain it with. The judge entered and everyone stood. Then the room became quiet. I had imagined that moment many times. I thought I might feel angry. Instead, I felt tired. Not weak. Just tired of having to prove that what happened to me had happened at all. The first evidence presented was simple. Medical access records. The hospital confirmed that my old authorization had been used to access private information after my pregnancy began. The room stayed silent. Then came the dates, appointments, records, information that had later appeared in conversations with my sister. My lawyer didn't make a speech. She didn't need to. She placed one document beside another, then another. The judge examined each page carefully. My mother finally spoke. I was only trying to help my daughter. Her voice shook. My lawyer looked toward her but didn't argue. The evidence continued. The missing mail. The strange deliveries. The messages. The photographs taken outside my home. The controlled information we had planted. Each piece showed the same pattern. Private information entered one place. Then it appeared somewhere it shouldn't have been. My sister kept shaking her head. No, she whispered. Her attorney leaned toward her and said something I couldn't hear. She ignored him. The judge asked for the surveillance photographs. They were displayed one by one. Our house. Our driveway. The front door. The windows. I remembered seeing those images for the first time. Back then, they had made my stomach turn. Now I looked at them from across a courtroom and felt something different. Distance. They were no longer something I had to explain. They were evidence. Then came the anonymous child protection complaint. My lawyer explained how it contained private medical details and information that had never been available to a stranger. The judge read the pages quietly. My sister's breathing became louder. My mother looked down. For the first time, I saw people in my family understanding what I had understood months earlier. This had never been a collection of coincidences. It had been a pattern. Then the storage unit evidence was introduced. The room changed before anyone even saw the photographs. The detective described what they had found. 2 cribs. Newborn clothes. A rocking chair. A dresser. The small sheep-shaped lamp. Clouds painted across the walls. Then he mentioned the names. My daughter's names. The room went completely silent. Someone behind me whispered something. My mother covered her mouth. My sister stared straight ahead. The detective continued. There were copies of my medical records. My stolen mail. Photographs of my home. Notes about my movements. And a draft complaint designed to question my ability to care for my children. Then came the rental records. The storage unit had been paid for by my mother. I heard a soft gasp somewhere behind us. My mother began crying. I didn't know, she said. But the judge looked at the records. You paid the rental expenses? My mother wiped her face. I was trying to help her. That sentence hung in the room. Again. Always help. Always protection. Always some reason why the damage was supposed to be forgiven. My lawyer then presented the controlled information test. The false detail we had given my mother had appeared in a message from my sister. It was information nobody else had received. The chain was clear. My mother had access. My sister received the information. And the information had been used against me. My sister suddenly stood. Her attorney tried to stop her. She pushed his hand away. You don't understand. Her voice echoed across the courtroom. The judge told her to sit down. She didn't. You don't know what she did to me. I looked at her. I didn't say anything. She pointed toward me. She knew. The room became tense. She knew I was supposed to have them. My husband's hand tightened around mine. The judge warned her again. But my sister was no longer listening. She was crying now. Not quietly. She looked directly at me. Those babies were supposed to be mine. And there it was. The sentence that no report could have written. The sentence that no lawyer could soften. The sentence that finally explained the cake knife. The medical records. The surveillance. The nursery. Everything. A few people began whispering. Then the whispers stopped. The courtroom was silent again. My sister stood there breathing hard, as though she had finally said the truth she had been carrying for months. I looked at my mother. She was crying. But for once, I didn't feel responsible for comforting her. The judge ordered my sister to sit. She slowly lowered herself into the chair. Then the judge reviewed the remaining evidence. There was no dramatic speech from me. There didn't need to be. The room had already heard enough. My silence had carried me farther than any argument could have. By the end of the hearing, the judge had enough evidence to make the next decisions. A full protective order was granted. My sister was ordered to undergo a psychiatric evaluation and follow the treatment recommendations. The restrictions around contact with me and my children were made clear. And my mother's involvement would not simply disappear because she claimed she had meant well. As we walked out of the courtroom, I didn't feel victorious. I felt relieved. For months, I had wondered whether anyone would believe me. Now I understood something better. I had never needed everyone to believe me. I had only needed the truth to survive long enough to be seen. And finally, it had. My sister's words changed everything. Not because they were the most shocking thing she had ever said. Because they were the first words she had spoken that nobody could explain away. Those babies were supposed to be mine. The courtroom had gone completely silent after she said it. Even her own attorney looked stunned. My mother sat frozen behind her. For months, she had told everyone that my sister was grieving, that she was overwhelmed, that she didn't understand what she was doing. But grief had never explained the storage unit. It hadn't explained the stolen mail. It hadn't explained the medical records. And it certainly hadn't explained the nursery with my daughter's names painted on the walls. Now, sitting in that courtroom, I finally understood that the truth had been there long before anyone was willing to admit it. My sister had lost her pregnancy. My mother had helped her pretend she hadn't. And somewhere along the way, my sister had stopped seeing my pregnancy as something separate from her loss. She had started seeing my babies as replacements. That did not make her pain meaningless. But it did make the danger real. The judge ordered her to sit down. She slowly lowered herself into the chair. Her face was wet with tears. For the first time, she looked less like the angry woman who had terrified me at the baby shower and more like someone who had completely lost control of the story she had built around herself. I felt sorry for her, but I did not feel responsible for saving her. That distinction took me years to understand. The hearing continued. My lawyer explained the history of the medical access records. The hospital confirmed that my mother had used an old authorization to access information that should have remained private. Then the storage unit records showed that my mother had paid for the space. The evidence connected her to the place where my stolen information had been collected and where the nursery had been prepared. My mother tried to explain. I was trying to protect her, she said. Her voice was quiet. She looked toward me. I thought if I kept her calm, everything would eventually be okay. I listened. I had spent so much of my life wanting my mother to understand what she had done to me. But hearing her explain it in that courtroom made something clear. She still thought the problem was that my sister had been hurt. She didn't fully understand that she had allowed my sister's pain to become my burden. She had protected one daughter by exposing another. And she had expected me to accept it because I had always been the strong one. But strength had never meant that I had to surrender my privacy. It had never meant that I had to risk my children's safety. And it certainly had never meant that I had to stay silent while someone built a life around taking mine apart. The judge reviewed the evidence carefully before making the final orders. A full protective order was granted. My sister was ordered to undergo a psychiatric evaluation. She was also required to follow the treatment recommendations that came from that evaluation. The restrictions were clear. No unwanted contact. No approaching our home. No attempts to obtain information about my children. No interference with our lives. There were also consequences for my mother. Her involvement would not disappear simply because she claimed her intentions had been loving. The records existed. The payments existed. The access logs existed. Intent could explain a decision. It could not erase what the decision had caused. When the hearing ended, people began moving slowly toward the exits. I noticed some of my relatives avoiding my eyes. Others looked at me differently. Not with pity. Not with doubt. With something closer to shame. One aunt quietly approached me in the hallway. I should have believed you, she said. I looked at her. She waited for an answer. I simply nodded. There was nothing else I needed to say. For years, my family had been built around keeping my sister comfortable. Everyone had learned to adjust around her. I had learned to shrink around her. My happiness became something I announced carefully. My problems became something I solved privately. My pain became something I was expected to carry without making anyone uncomfortable. But that day, something had changed. I no longer wanted their approval. I didn't need my mother to admit she had chosen my sister over me. I didn't need my sister to apologize. And I didn't need the relatives who had ignored the warning signs to suddenly become the family I had wanted all along. The court had done something more important. It had created distance. It had created boundaries. And it had given my husband and me the legal protection we needed to raise our daughters without constantly looking over our shoulders. Still, the hardest part was not over. I had to decide what came next. Because a protective order could keep someone away from my house. It could not erase the years of favoritism. It could not undo the trust one had lost. It could not change the fact that my own mother had helped create a nursery for children she had no right to claim. That night, I returned home and stood quietly in the doorway of my daughter's room. 2 cribs. 2 blankets. 2 tiny lives sleeping peacefully. I watched them for several minutes. Then I realized something. The real victory had never been getting my family to admit I was right. It was giving my daughters a future where they would never have to earn the right to be protected. My husband stood beside me. "We're going to be okay," he said. I looked at him and smiled. For once, I believed it. The next morning, we started making plans to leave. Not because we were running away. Because we were finally choosing where our family belonged. And for the first time in my life, I was ready to stop being the person who held everyone else together. I was ready to protect the family that needed me most. We left with 2 newborn girls, a few boxes, and a decision that had taken me years to make. We were leaving. Not because we were afraid. Not because we had lost. And certainly not because my family had won. We were leaving because I had finally understood that peace was not something I owed everyone else. For years, I had believed keeping my family together was my responsibility. If my sister was upset, I adjusted. If my mother was worried, I reassured her. If someone crossed a line, I found a reason to forgive it. I thought that was what being the strong daughter meant. But standing in my daughter's nursery that morning, I realized how wrong I had been. My girls were still so small. One of them was sleeping with her tiny hand curled near her cheek. The other had kicked off her blanket. I gently pulled it back over her. They knew nothing about courtrooms. They knew nothing about storage units or medical records. They didn't know that someone had painted their names on a wall before they were even born. They only knew my voice. And I wanted that voice to be the one that taught them what safety felt like. My husband and I began packing quietly. There was no dramatic goodbye. No final family argument. No speech to my mother about everything she had done. I had already said enough through the evidence. And the court had said the rest. The protective order remained in place. My sister was required to undergo psychiatric evaluation and treatment. My mother had to face the consequences of her involvement. Some relatives apologized. Others tried to explain why they had failed to see what was happening. One told me she thought I was exaggerating. Another admitted she had always assumed I could handle anything. I didn't blame them. But I didn't make excuses for them either. There was a difference. I could forgive someone without giving them the same access to my life. That was another lesson I had never understood before. Forgiveness did not require permission to hurt me again. Distance did not mean hatred. And boundaries did not mean I had stopped loving my family. They meant I had finally started protecting myself. For the first time, I allowed myself to think about the years before all of this. The family dinners. The birthdays. The moments when my sister received everyone's attention while I quietly moved into the background. I remembered my mother's familiar words. "You're the strong one." I used to hear that sentence and feel proud. Later, I understood what it had cost me. Being called strong had sometimes meant nobody checked whether I was hurting. It had meant my feelings were easier to ignore. It had meant everyone assumed I would understand. But my daughters would not grow up believing that. I wanted them to know that kindness was not the same as surrender. That love was not the same as obedience. And that family did not have the right to cross every boundary simply because they shared your blood. We moved to a new place where nobody knew our history. There was no storage unit. No family argument waiting behind the front door. No one watching from across the street. Just a small home, 2 cribs, and the ordinary sounds of newborn life. Some mornings were exhausting. Some nights felt endless. There were bottles to wash, diapers to change, and 2 babies who somehow always needed something at exactly the same time. But I loved those moments. They were ours. No one else had planned them. No one else had assigned them meaning. My daughters were simply my daughters. And that was enough. Sometimes I still thought about my mother. I wondered whether she understood what she had done. Maybe she did. Maybe she didn't. I stopped waiting for the perfect apology. I stopped expecting my family to become the family I had always hoped they would be. That was not bitterness. It was acceptance. I had spent too long trying to make everyone understand me. In the end, the truth had done that work better than I ever could. The records had spoken. The photographs had spoken. The storage unit had spoken. The court had listened. And I had finally learned to listen to myself. I think about that sometimes when my daughters are asleep. How close I came to believing that keeping everyone happy was more important than keeping my children safe. It wasn't. It never could be. Family should be a place where you can breathe. Where your happiness doesn't threaten someone else's identity. Where your privacy is respected. Where love does not come with ownership. And when those things disappear, protecting yourself is not selfish. It is necessary. My daughters will grow up knowing that their mother loved deeply. But they will also know that love has boundaries. That quiet people can still be strong. That documenting the truth matters when words are dismissed. And that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from the people who keep asking you to sacrifice yourself for their comfort. I used to think strength meant holding everyone together. Now I know better. Sometimes strength means knowing what must be protected. And sometimes, the family you save is the one you build yourself. If someone in your own family kept dismissing you until the evidence became impossible to ignore, would you keep explaining yourself, or quietly document everything and walk away? Tell me what you would do. And if you want more stories about family betrayal, hidden truths, and the quiet moments when everything finally comes to light, subscribe. There are more stories waiting.